Aujourd'hui, je vais parler de this relatively new concept of how the new American aristocracy, or the so-called 9.9 percenters, are viewed by me, who ostensibly is also part of it. But I'm also Asian, so I can't even tell if I'm part of POC, so who the heck knows, right? I am so special that somehow I'm invisible. So let's explore. Hey, XenPuck here. So actually, I've seen a clip on PBS about this segmentation of the population called the 9.9 percenter, maybe a year or two ago. This very much intrigued me because the original 1% versus 99% type of social commentary split always rubbed me the wrong way, not only because I was part of the 1% at some point, but as many have pointed out, having been in the 1% doesn't really make you a 1%er forever, right? In fact, people tend to drift in and out of that group all the time. My experience in it was just for a few lucky years, when I still had a high-paying job that I got mostly by luck, right? So, in the economic discourse generally speaking, how do I see myself? Apparently, numerically at least, I'm safely in the top 10%, right? Thus making my inclusion of being in the 9.9 percenter seemingly assured. Recall that they call it the 9.9 percenter instead of the top 10%, mostly to distinguish the group from the actual ultra-rich, which is the 0.1%. I think that's fair. Honestly, there's no point comparing ourselves to the musks and Bezos of the world, right? They have as much monetary concerns in common with me as I have with a toddler, so yeah, we can just ignore those people entirely. Still, it's not until I read this article in The Atlantic, a link in the description below, that I had more of a nuanced reaction to this idea that the group I am in now can be called a new aristocracy. So this article, by the way, is actually practically a mini novella. It's so long, so I won't and basically can't rebut this whole thing in 10 minutes. Instead, I'll just pick and choose a few key points that I found ironic or absurd, and finally make a call on whether I think I'm even part of it, right? As far as the author's contention as to who the 9.9 percenters really are, right? So point number one, right? One thing that Arthur pointed out that I find very strange is the idea that we Americans in the past few decades have carved out a new aristocratic class at all. I mean, a top decile just implies, well, upper middle class, right? And in what society has that ever disappeared or suddenly appeared, especially since such a class is comparative, right? There's always going to be a top decile. The only question is how concentrated their power and influence is, and when does this comparative class of people become an aristocracy exactly? I guess his point, the author's point, is that there's less generational elasticity within American society than in other places, and also that these days people tend to partner more with other people within the same class. I mean, wow. So the quote intergenerational elasticity was basically this sentence, okay, quote unquote. On this measure of economic mobility, the United States is more like Chile or Argentina than Japan or Germany. Okay, we're being compared to the Axis countries, and somehow that's considered a good standard? Hard pass, please. And on the assortative mating aspect, why exactly would that ever be a problem? Why would anybody want to date someone poorer if someone with similar economic circumstances were available? No, this isn't to say that money is even on most people's minds when it comes to dating, right? Unless you're, a lady looking for someone to take care of you, right? Maybe it is for the ultra-rich, but certainly not for most people, right? So like meeting like simply happens due to how and where we find ourselves socializing. I mean, I'm not going to go out of my way to diversify my dating pool just by going to a shadier neighborhood for the sake of some sort of class-mixing experiment for the good of society, right? Who the heck would do that? Anyway, my main point is this. What egalitarian paradise is the author comparing the US to that somehow doesn't have an upper middle class? A distinct one, anyway. Are we talking about the Scandinavian countries where the rich are afraid or ashamed to even talk about money? Or is it, say, like our neighbor Mexico, where the well-to-do all have to live behind fortified compounds to avoid kidnapping, right? I don't feel like we're doing poorly in the inequality aspect at all. At least we're able to talk about it, right? We don't just suppress it until the plebs get so repressed that the off with your heads movement will explode out of nowhere, right? And all this talk about impending catastrophe seems just premature at best. Okay. Point number 2, speaking of inequality, so the top decile has gained more than the bottom 90%. Okay, that's true. But this idea that somehow the current level of inequality will cause a massive incident of the violent proportions seems far-fetched, right? My reasons are simple. For one, the author points out that real estate gain has been uneven, which is absolutely true. But somehow, in all major cities where gains are the most, service workers still exist and get to work. They must live somewhere, right? Either by moving out further into the boondocks, increasing their own transportation costs, certainly, or more likely simply acting like immigrants and just live in more compact circumstances, right? This idea that US cities are stretched to a limit in terms of density due to local zoning restrictions is patently retarded. I mean, there's not a single US city that approaches anywhere near the most dense cities globally speaking, right? So every single high-cost US city can easily be more dense by most likely a factor of 10. There is absolutely enough space. If there's a will by the residents to curb their service costs, right, then NIMBYism will subside and the working class will be able to live somewhere in order to do their jobs, which is services, right? Now, I'm not saying they will get anywhere near a median American-sized apartment or a single-family house-sized dwelling, right? But honestly, in an advanced economy, most people will not hit the old-fashioned ways of measuring what the average type of housing is anymore. That's just reality that I feel like Americans have to catch up on. Again, this is just my opinion. Feel free to disagree in the comments below. Oh, and this whole, is our level of inequality going the way of going to cause presumably revolutions? I mean, I don't buy that because even the middle 50% of Americans, right, resentful as they may be to have elected someone like the orange douche, even those people are still doing so relatively well in the grand scheme of the world. I mean, we're talking about air conditioning in most homes, a supercomputer in the form of smartphones in everyone, including children's hands, and new vehicle sales that somehow sell on average over 30K. I mean, even the real middle class of Americans, they are not actually struggling in the grand scheme of things, right? Not that I'm saying that they can't be doing better, right? We can all be doing better. But even in the stagnating counties across this great country of ours, the actual floor of what's considered relatively stable living is high enough that I'm not worried about a Bolshevik-style revolution, right? Not now or in, I would say, 1 to 2 decades, right? Anything beyond that time scale? Who knows? Anyone's guess. Finally, as I read this gigantic article, right, I was getting more and more confused as to whether I should count myself as one of these 9.9%ers, right? Obviously not in terms of actual numbers, because I'd be in there in terms of actual numbers, but in terms of the author's contentions, right? Here's one quote about the career path of the so-called new aristocrats that gave me pause. Well over half of Ivy League graduates, for instance, typically go straight into one of 4 career tracks that are generally reserved for the well-educated: finance, management consulting, medicine, and law. Wow. I guess I didn't end up in any of these fields. Coincidentally, my wife did. So maybe she's part of the 9.9%ers, because I went into advertising and stumbled into tech somehow, and still ended up making more money in my last 5 years on average than most consultants or doctors or lawyers that I know, okay? So it almost seems like the author's contentions about these 9.9%ers are just much more specific, right? Specific in the sense that he also mentions, okay, more importantly, in terms of mentality of this new aristocratic class, right? Here's a direct quote. We're willing to strip everyone, including ourselves, of the universal right to a good education, adequate health care, adequate representation in the workplace, genuine equal opportunities, because we think we can win the game. But who really, in the end, is going to win this slippery game of escalating privileges? End quote. Oh boy, a lot to unpack here, okay. So the field of work thing, hey, maybe when the author wrote that, he forgot that the tech is the new finance or whatever. But the quote about mentalities where he lost me entirely, right? Maybe it's because I already hit fire, but I absolutely chose to not play the game, as he terms it, right? Because I've long learned that there's always someone who makes more money and can project more pressure or influence at a societal level, right? And trying to play a zero-sum games against those who have more money is just a dead end in terms of growing mentally or spiritually speaking, okay? I mean, how can I call someone who has this kind of social climbing mentality an aristocrat at all. To me, this always chasing up thing is actually kind of the opposite of the aristocratic mentality. It's just sad and pathetic. I mean, I know if I had kids, I would absolutely tell them to do whatever they want and not participate in the grind of work at all, if they can manage it themselves, of course. That's a true sign of being privileged, right? Not this bullshit mentality of still always aiming for more because there's something missing in your heart, right? Or in your mind, or in your mentality. That's the kind of mentality that somehow keeps workers bees of the Silicon Valley stuck, despite most of them being millionaires. Sad but true. In conclusion, I enjoyed reading this article, and I hope to inspire some of you to do the same, right? But honestly, mainly I learned that I've already grown out of the pathetic mentality of the upper middle class, who have immediately forgotten how good they have it to yearn for the perceived privileges of those above them. Okay? Nobody is above me, not a single person on this planet. And I've met billionaires and CEOs. None of them can hold a candle on me. Not because I'm smarter or work harder than them, okay, of course not. Because I'm mentally, resilient in myself, right? So I don't need the external validation that comes from the rest of society, because that's a big place, right? As long as I have my community, and, my level of comfort with them, that's totally good enough. All this talks about privileges or rights are moot. I can feel this way because I've already removed myself from the drudgery of modern work. So I hope you guys will join me too someday, because having a different mentality is much more rewarding than chasing some arbitrary class lines. Cheers. Alla prochaine.